Good morning. My name is Steve Bentley. I'm with the Calgary Climate Hub, and welcome to our daily coverage of COP28. Spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play in the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Yaqtsi Nakota Nations, the Métis Nation of Region 3, and all people that make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. To also make a second land acknowledgement on behalf of another group of folks that have a stake in this land that we stand on today. That's our children, our nieces, nephews, and grandchildren, and all future generations. I urge you to keep them in mind during this time as we face unprecedented change and start making decisions about what comes next. Okay, COP28, there's 2 days left on the official schedule. Just a reminder, COP28 is a global conference, the biggest of its kind for climate. That's where the countries of the world come together. They make promises. They often deliver big projects ahead of time, but there's also quite a lot of jockeying for position and reason to be both hopeful and cynical. Some of the big topics this year are global stock taking. It's a process for countries and stakeholders to see where they're collectively making progress towards meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, where they're not. There's a historic work on health. Believe it or not, health is barely mentioned in all 27 prior COPs, and that's become something that is now being at least talked about. There's a historic loss and damage fund for the world's richest countries to help the world's poorest and most vulnerable countries respond to the climate disaster they're already experiencing and what is already guaranteed to be coming their way. Climate disaster largely not of their own making. Devil's in the details on that, as it is with every piece of this. There's a talk of a global tripling of renewable energy and a doubling of energy efficiency by 2030. Regarding methane emissions, Canada has signed on to a 75% reduction of methane emissions from the oil and gas sector by 2030. More on that in a bit. One of the biggest pieces that is sort of the specter that is overhanging all of COP is whether there will be a fossil fuel phase out or whether it's an unabated fossil fuel phase out or a phase down. The difference being there, if it's unabated, then we're really talking about relying heavily on carbon capture and storage, something that quite a lot of climate activists have a large amount of skepticism about and believe that's creating cover for oil and gas to do the exact same things they've always done as the world burns around us. Great time for hope and cynicism. As I mentioned, there's never been more cause for cynicism, especially given that this year it's being held in a petrostate, and the president of COP is an oil and gas executive for a large oil company called ADNOC. And just a few headlines. These are the exact kind of headlines you don't want coming out of your climate conference. COP president denies using summit for oil deals. COP president says there's no science behind demands for a phase out of fossil fuels. COP president denies he doesn't respect climate science. You don't want a whole bunch of denies in your outcomes for this. And I'll remind you, this is far and away the largest conference of its sort. There's nothing else really like this. And it's critical for where we go in this world on climate. So with us today to help us break all this down, today's guest is one of Western Canada's best energy journalists who has been, amongst a great many other things, on an unprecedented and desperately needed deep dive into the industry capture of Alberta's energy regulator. He is the intrepid Markham Hislop. How are you doing, Markham?
I'm fine, thanks, Steve. I've never been called intrepid before. And
You
trust me, I get called a lot of names. Intrepid is not one of them.
You've earned it, and I picked that word out specifically as I was figuring out how I was going to introduce you. That's what you are, buddy. You're intrepid. Okay, so to begin with, just panning back at the largest level possible, this is the world's climate conference. And, there is a lot of conversation about, that big oil needs a seat at the table. But you could argue big oil is trying to drive the bus at this conference. What was your immediate response when you found out that this COP was being held in Dubai and proceeded over by an oil company executive?
Well, I wasn't all that dismayed. And one of the reasons is I'm a technology determinist to some extent, Steve, as you know
Right.
from previous conversations we've had. And I pay a lot of attention to where the adoption rates now of clean energy technology. So the top 5 or 6: wind, solar, batteries, EVs, heat pumps, and electrolyzers for making hydrogen.
Mhm.
And the progress over the last 4 or 5 years, but particularly since 2020, is absolutely stunning. I mean,
Yeah.
these technologies are now past their inflection point. They're growing exponentially, and these are the technologies where, like, if we're going to argue for a phase out or a phase down of fossil fuels, these are the technologies that would displace them. And
Right.
in most cases, the clean energy technologies are more economic and they have a higher value to the consumers than the fossil fuels they replace. And that will only increase over time as we keep getting economies of scale and prices go down and so on. So to be honest, I think that the COP, this big fight. It's really a big bun fight, and OPEC showed up in force, and the Canadian oil and gas industry showed up in force, and Alberta government showed up in force, and they're all singing from the same song sheet. The OPEC narrative, which is we don't want to phase down oil and gas. We want to eliminate the production emissions, the scope 1 and 2 emissions from the production of oil and gas. And so I think that the way to counter that is not to argue with them about phasing out or phasing down oil and gas. It's to say, well, what got us to the point now where we're already displacing a couple of million barrels a day of demand? Well, it's electric transportation. It's wind and solar. Why? I would argue that we should put much, much more emphasis on that. And this is where I have some hope, Steve,
Mhm.
because I spent the weekend reading 2 reports from the International Energy Agency. The first one is the Technology
Just for a
Energy.
second there, the International Energy Agency, by the way, no screaming left wing organization,
No,
right? They're pretty hard nosed science and dollars and cents on the energy industry folks, right?
right. Unless you're talking to Saudi Aramco or ExxonMobil CEOs,
Right.
and then they're radical political
Sure.
organization. But that,
Yeah.
that we don't believe that. So
Right.
anyway, here's the point. The report was Energy Technology Perspectives 2023, and then a follow-up report they did 4 or 5 months ago, which was the state of clean energy technology manufacturing. And in there, it talks in great depth. And this is one of the things that isn't appreciated about the IEA, how much analysis it pumps out in a year. I
Right.
mean, if you want to know where things are at, you can comb through those reports and find out pretty quick. So what I wanted to know was China's role in building out clean energy manufacturing, building solar panels, building wind turbines, building batteries, building EVs. And what I discovered, well, I kind of knew this, but that China has 80% of the manufacturing capacity of all of those key clean energy technologies. And what they did 20 years ago, they decided that they would leapfrog over all the old, fossil fuel based technology like internal combustion engines, and they invested hundreds of billions of dollars to scale up, to get these companies established and then scale them up over time. And then they subsidize hundreds of billions of dollars. They subsidize adoption of those technologies. So they
Right.
had, electric vehicle subsidies, those sorts of things. And so now China stands as the preeminent clean energy industry power in the world. And I often liken China's role today to the United States role coming out of World War II,
Right.
where the US had geared up for the war, its industrial production, and essentially the reason it beat the Nazis and so on is because it could produce more planes, more ships, more tanks, more of that, and they simply overwhelmed the Allies overwhelmed their
Mhm.
opponents. So that's where China is today. And in 2020, and I often refer to this speech, so anybody who's heard me talk about this before, please forgive me. But Gina Raimondo is the Secretary of Commerce for the US. And she has given speeches and she said, the Americans have a very clear vision of what clean energy industrial policy and strategy is about. And she says, look, we woke up in 2020 during the pandemic, and we discovered the extent to which China controlled the supply chains that we were reliant upon. And they understood that given where the world was going towards clean energy, that this would make the US extremely vulnerable and it would erode their geopolitical power. And they said, they're Americans, right? They said, we can't have this. And so they brought in the Infrastructure Act, and they brought in the CHIPS Act, and they brought in the Inflation Reduction Act. They have now committed over $1 trillion over the next decade to build out a clean energy industry in North America and also to subsidize adoption. Pretty, in many ways, kind of what the Chinese were doing. Then the Europeans looked at that, and the Europeans were no slackers. They know they've been in this game for a while. They looked at what the Americans did and said, holy moly, we better give, so they invested $400 billion of their own in Green Industrial Deal to boost that. And essentially, this has ignited a clean energy arms race.
Right.
And so what I came away from those reports, to get back to them, is that even given, so let's call it $1.5 trillion between the US and Europe in building out clean energy manufacturing, that will only get those two regions to keep pace with China between now and the early 2030s. China is not backing off. China is going to continue to expand its manufacturing base in all of those key technologies because it wants to maintain its lead. So what's going to happen? Well, EVs are going to be cheaper, and solar is going to be cheaper, and wind's going to be cheaper, and battery prices are going to fall, and adoption is going to soar because China is going to need markets for these, so they're going to for their surplus production. By 2030, their production of solar panels will be 2 to 3 times what the entire world can adopt in a year.
Right.
That's crazy. So what are they going to do? They're going to move into India. They're going to sell in India. They're going to sell in Africa. They're going to sell in Latin America. They're going to sell in other, Pakistan, Bangladesh, places like that. And the very thing that we're trying to do with phasing down fossil fuels, they're going to do, and the other government in regions like US and Europe and Japan and South Korea, they're going to displace fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. And so I think the smarter strategy here is to stop fighting. Like, don't go against the flow. Instead, focus on the area where the flow is, the river's going that way. Don't go upstream, go downstream. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the draft text that came out this morning, and read paragraph 39, and it talks about everything I just mentioned is in paragraph 39. And everybody agrees on paragraph 39. So I think that strategically COP28, we're making a mistake. And I think that we should focus on expanding clean energy manufacturing, and that would get us to where we need to go and want to go much quicker than this fight over phase down and phase out of fossil fuels.
So I guess what a lot of folks would say is that we've got to be able to do both of those things. We got to be able to walk and chew gum, because what we see is that emissions have been going up, not down, and increasingly the oil companies want to do more production, not less. So and then I guess one of the things about when you have that as a prime goal, and so Al Gore described if there is no phase out language, that this will be a failure of COP28. So it's a point of differentiation between you and Al Gore.
Al's wrong, by the way.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. You heard it right here from Markham Hislop.
Yeah, that's right.
So, but are you surprised the degree to which fossil fuels not just at COP, but even just this year, it seems like when you're talking about climate, increasingly more and more people are laying the blame on fossil fuel companies who've by all accounts have been dishonest to a really terrible degree since the choose either the 70s or the 80s or the 60s or whenever you want your start point to be. Um, it seems, and then this particular COP, talk of the fossil fuel phase out is way more on the front burner than I saw it in 27 or 26. And, I mean, I guess there is a trend that's going on here. And, if this doesn't happen in a vacuum, this is also the world's worst year for climate disasters. And so it seems like, there's this confluence of things that are making everybody more aware of the role fossil fuel companies are playing, but also at this great big global conference, it just seems to be a really prime focus. I would have said more people in COP26. I heard more people talking about electrification in COP26 than I did a phase out of fossil fuels, for example. So does that dovetail with what you're seeing around in the socials and with the people that you're talking to?
Yes, but I don't attach the same importance to it that you do. I think we might have a little
Let me just correct you for 1 second there, though. I do feel like I understand where you're coming from, and I often feel like I've felt probably since 2010 or so that eventually the world is just going to come on to this cheaper form of energy, which was going to become gradually cheaper and cheaper, and that the disasters were going to be pushing this better technology at us, and it ends up being a triple deal in that it's usually better for your health too. It's usually
Yeah.
cheaper, better for climate, better for health, and so I do get the. In fact, for some time, I've sort of pushed this position within the Calgary Climate Hub that we're better advocating for the solutions than getting into a fight with Alberta's oil and gas companies. They've got a budget 3,000 times our more than that. But yeah, I get where you're coming from. But I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, it's no problem. And the reason why is take a look at Canada. Canada is a very good example. So the federal Liberals have been in since 2016. They brought in a whole suite. This is the most ambitious climate policy that we've seen outside of Europe. Certainly more ambitious than the Americans, certainly more ambitious than the Asian countries and other countries. And they've had a lot of trouble implementing it because in Canada, we're a very decentralized federation. We need the provinces to be on side in order to do this. And we've seen the struggles, right? But the point I'm getting at here is part of the delay in implementing things like the clean electricity regulations, clean fuel standards, and so on is the influence the oil and gas industry has on the federal government. Sure. I know that the industry and the Alberta government, the politicians in Alberta, love to portray Trudeau, the prime minister and the Liberals, as hating the oil and gas, wanting to phase out. In fact, nothing is further from the truth. They are very mainstream when it comes. You put them in COP, and they're right in the middle, maybe even leaning a little towards the fossil fuel folks. But so both the government and the industry lobbyists have had tremendous success over the last few years, either slowing down and delaying the implementation of Canadian climate policy or diluting it. And you saw that again, the oil and gas oil and gas emissions cap regulations, the draft ones that were announced by Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault at COP28, big, huge pushback from Alberta and the industry. So the issue for me is that kind of influence and power is so baked into the cake around, it is a feature of the system. It's a feature of the machine all over the world. And I don't think that given how, and here's another key point. The World Petroleum Congress was held in Calgary, where you are, in September. And I attended, I was reporting on it. And the only thing that came out of that Congress was of any significance is all of the industry everywhere across the world bought onto the narrative that you saw at COP28 from the oil and gas industry, which is no phase out. Oil and gas is going to grow out to 2045, and gas markets and LNG are going to expand. And so the focus should be on reducing scope 1 and 2 emissions, getting those to net zero, and we don't
via
worry.
carbon capture, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the big part of it. It's not the 100%, but that's maybe 2/3 of the strategy in Canada. So my point is, and then the OPEC World Oil Outlook came out 2 weeks after the Congress, and it provided all the analytical underpinnings for that narrative, right? And so you see the Alberta government politicians talking about that all the time, and it's designed expressly to push back against the fossil fuel phase out narrative. And they're very good at it. They have incredible resources. They have a lot of influence with governments around the world. And don't forget, the national oil companies produce more than 50% of the oil in the world. So and that revenue then goes to support, the Saudi government or whichever, Nigeria, take a pick. They rely on that. So there's a tremendous institutional road bump here, or a barrier to having the fossil fuel phase down argument. There isn't, but there is general agreement, at least on paper, to scale up clean energy technology. So I can't say it enough. Our best strategy is not phase out; it's displace with better, cheaper technology.
Yeah, I think displacing a certain amount of this is already happening, even though that we are creating more emissions more than ever, and I think displacement is the inevitable end game that happens. And I also think big oil sort of probably knows more than any of us about when that's actually going to happen, as they've always known. There's what they tell everybody, and then there's what they take from their own scientists and experts.
Oh, if I may interrupt just a second, Steve, because I think that's partly true. I mean, they're a cynical bunch, right?
Yeah.
They know how to play politics. But I would say, because I interviewed a number of people, like the head of the African Oil Producers Association, the degree to which they have bought into what I think a flawed analysis of oil and gas demand out to 2050. They do believe they're not just being cynical. They really do believe a lot of their own narrative, and that is actually part of the problem.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough, and that makes sense to me. One of the things that I was reading, Noel Keogh on Twitter. He's from Sustainable Calgary. I don't know if you know. Do you know Noel?
I do.
Okay,
Sure.
good. Yeah. So he was in response to the one of the big targets of this COP was the global tripling of renewable energy. And so his response was like, look, I don't want to be a party pooper here, but market forces are doing this already. It's kind of like patting yourself on the back for something that's literally already happening and pretty much unstoppable. Do you share Noel's view on that?
Yes, and I'd go one step further. I'd say instead of tripling it, quadruple it, quintuple it, sextuple it. Let's raise the ambition, because it's very clear that wind and solar are now the cheapest way to generate electricity. And I know in Alberta it's very trendy to say, oh yeah, but the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. Well, I interview American utility executives where the American power sector is just being re-engineered in real time down there. There's tremendous change that we don't see up here. And they say, look, we think we can, we're at about 33%, and we think we can get up to 50% renewables into the grid by 2025, 2027. And then we're going to be looking at more storage. And but here's the point. They're now buying wind at 1 cent per kilowatt hour, $10 a megawatt hour. And they're buying solar at 2 cents per kilowatt hour, or $20 per megawatt hour. You can't produce electricity any cheaper than that.
Right.
And so the industry is grappling with ways to integrate intermittent inverter-based sources, they call it, intermittent energy sources into their power grid that they're modernizing. And there is all kinds of stuff like market, time of use pricing, for example, trading with your regional partners, which we don't do in Canada. There's demand response. There's different types of storage, battery. Lithium ion batteries are common now, but there's zinc ion and iron ion coming. There's compressed air, hydrogen as a storage medium. I mean, there's so much innovation in this space, and frankly, it's kind of keeping up with the rollout of renewables in the U.S. And the Chinese are doing that in a big way now. So this idea that renewables are going to be limited to like a third of the generating capacity on a power grid, I think is going to be myth is going to be blown out of the water. So why not, especially because we have the spare capacity for manufacturing solar panels in China, why not subsidize the bejeebers out of that and raise our ambitions on renewable energy installations and don't stop at 3 times.
Right. Couldn't agree more. One of the things I want to mention is you talk about China and the degree to which they really, hopped onto this built a lot of this train as far as renewables go. I mean, they're when you look at how cheap solar is, you start with China and how much this superpower put in and how that affected change. I'm wondering if this one story crossed your desk. I saw it. I think it's a big deal. I don't hear anybody talking about it. I've only seen 1 or 2 outlets report it. But Joe Biden, American president, heading into COP, implemented the WAR Act to start pushing out heat pumps. And to me, when I hear about a superpower choosing a really, really good climate solution like China did with solar, and if America does it with heat pumps, this might be one of the bigger stories, not just heading into COP, but heading into 2023 or in climate generally. It's still early days, but have you heard of that story? Has that come across your desk?
I think I saw the headline, but I haven't reported on it and I haven't read anything on it. But yes, but I think you're right. But that's only part of the broader American strategy. I would recommend anybody who's watching this go and Google 2 individuals. One is Gina Raimondo, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce that I mentioned earlier. The other one is Chris Dees. Dees, and he was President Biden's former Economic Advisory Council chairman, and he's given some speeches on American and clean energy industrial policy. And one of the things that strikes me is the clarity of vision. The clarity of vision. Like if you listen to Prime Minister Trudeau or Natural Resources Minister John Wilkinson, even, Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault, they have this kind of fuzzy, we got to do this because it's nice. And, our neighbors are kind of, investing in this. So we got to keep up if we can. And, it's very much a muddling through kind of, there's no clarity of vision the way there is in the United States. The Americans get it. And man, when you turn the Americans onto something, I will give them that. That and baseball are their two greatest contributions to human history. But when they get focused on something like this, they almost can't be stopped. And if their goal is to catch China, they might not do it by 2030, but they'll do it eventually. And the degree to which the Inflation Reduction Act and these other pieces of legislation have unleashed innovation and new investment, private sector investment in the United States, is just not well appreciated in Canada. And I interview a lot of American experts, and I ask them about this. Is, well, you're in this battery space for stationary storage. How is the Inflation Reduction Act affecting you? And the CEO of a startup will say, "Holy man, you have no idea. All of a sudden, private capital is getting unleashed. We're getting offers for our next round of financing, and we're expanding, and we're doing this and that, and it's not just us; it's our competitors and it's people in this. It is a madhouse south of the border. It's just a gold rush, is what it is. It's a 2023 gold rush. And up in Canada, we go, no, we're going to stick with natural gas.
Yeah.
we gotta protect what we got. We have made the incumbents' mistake. So let me explain the incumbents' dilemma. When your business model is disrupted by new products, new services, new technology, and Eastman Kodak in digital photography is one of the better known examples of this. You essentially have three options. You can pivot to another business model. You can re-engineer your existing business model, and then you can, if you don't see that you have two options, either one of those options is available to you, then you double down on the status quo. And that's exactly what we've seen in the global oil and gas industry, and we've seen it in the Canadian industry. Suncor, which was the most of the big Canadian oil companies, was the furthest along in trying to invest in energy transition, startups and wind and solar and hydrogen and those. And then they hired CEO Rich Kruger, an old veteran hand, and they just jettisoned all of that. Very famously made headlines all over Canada, and they just said, we're going back to our knitting, and we're just going to make a bunch of money and give it back to shareholders. 75%, by the way, whom live outside of Canada.
Right.
So what we're seeing is the industry is doubling down on the status quo. They're retrenching all over the place. And so rather than ragging on the oil and gas industry to phase out or to pivot and spend more of its profits on energy trends, like executive director of the IEA, Dr. Fatih Birol, he even makes this mistake. He says, no, oil and gas companies should be reinvesting these profits. They don't want to.
Yeah.
They will ride the decline curve to failure before they do that. And so why keep fighting with them to do something they don't want to do? We should come up with strategies that go around them. So and I'll give it your viewers an example. So I've argued for years now that the pivot for Alberta oil sands producers, and that's the biggest oil, they're the eighth largest oil producer in the world. What they should do is use the research being done by Alberta Innovates, the provincial innovation agency, on turning bitumen into carbon fiber and other materials like asphalt binder and activated carbon and so on. And they should build an advanced materials manufacturing industry in Alberta that uses bitumen as a feedstock, so that eventually, as demand for bitumen declines, you can begin to use more and more of it in your domestic markets. And then of course you'd have to clean up the emissions intensity of bitumen, and you'd have to get put the industry on a environmentally sustainable basis, which it currently is. So that's a big complex issue. But my point here is, you wouldn't ask the oil and gas companies to do that, to invest in carbon fiber. You might find private sector companies. You might create a crown corporation. You might there's all sorts of ways that an entrepreneurial government in Edmonton could foment the growth of this guy. And one of the reasons is it owns the intellectual property for it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it gives it tremendous leverage to get this industry off the ground. So let the oil and gas companies do what they do over there. Just make them clean, get their emissions down, tax them, all of that stuff. And then over here, build up the industry that's based on 21st century energy. In this story, it's the advanced materials manufacturing. And I think that we should be doing that all over the globe. Don't be I wouldn't say ignore the oil and gas industry, but don't ask it to do things that it will actively oppose. Go around it. Build the alternate, the clean energy economy without them. And if they want to ride that decline curve down to failure during the 2030s, let them.
So
That's their
here's the
business.
thing, though, is and again, I feel like I had a very, very similar position for for much of my climate activism world or experience, but ultimately, every day that our emissions are going up, that we're getting closer to passing by the 1.5 degrees, and there's quite a lot of people in the world that think we're that's insurmountable. We're going to hit that anyways. Not in that it's inevitable. Um, the thing is that while we're doing all these better things for the world, we really have to stop putting more gasoline on the fire, and it's been made abundantly clear by Alberta Oil and Gas and by OPEC over the weekend, and by every other big oil voice that's out there, that they plan on burning throwing in as much gas in the fire as they can possibly extract money for. And what I would say is, no, you don't get to do that. And we're not afraid of you, and we'll stop you. And I think we have to do that. And I think morally we have to do that. Like the global south is on fire regular. We just had the worst wildfire season ever here in Alberta. I don't have to tell you. And I feel like I get that it's easier to go around them, but I also feel an enormous sense of injustice that we have to go around them when they should stop burning our cities.
I get that.
Yeah.
And that's a perfectly fair argument. I mean, these SOBs have misled us for decades, and they exert enormous influence on our governments for their own selfish purposes, their own, their shareholders and their, bloated salaries and all of that kind of stuff. I get that.
Mm.
And I share some of your outrage. But as I look around the globe, I go, okay, well, how would we do that? Like, which governments are open to that kind of a conversation? And if there's a handful of them, I'd be really surprised. And Canada is not among them. Canada, under the Liberal Party, is quite happy to take a sticks and carrot approach and an incremental
And
approach to
and
the.
and mainly carrots.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Let's. Yes, that's
Yeah.
that's a fair comment. So
Right.
the United States, I mean, I was just looking at some data this morning. The United States is now far and away the world's largest oil producer at 13.1 million barrels a day, followed by Russia, I think was around 10 point something, and then Saudi Arabia, which is an incredibly low cost producer, was down to like 9.4. Can you imagine a conversation in the United States where Biden or somebody else says, yeah, we're going to phase out oil and gas production in this? I can't wrap my head around that. I can't see that it would happen. You might get away with it in Norway. You might get away with it in Scotland. You might, but I'd be skeptical of that. I just don't see the political. I'll go back to what Ralph Klein, the old Alberta premier, and I
Right.
very seldom quote Ralph, but I quote this one all the time. And that is, politicians don't lead. Politicians find a parade and get out in front of it.
Right.
And
Yep.
the parade here is clean energy, is clean energy technology and industry and more rapid adoption. So fighting this rearguard action in the trenches with the while I appreciate the emotion, I mean, if I see a bully out in the schoolyard, I want to go smack him in the head too. I get that. But I think given where we're at and the resources at our disposal and the politics of this thing, I and it hasn't produced much in the way of success so far. Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, I think will get us to where we are today, which is basically, no results.
Right. My only the only thing that I would counter with is recent findings are that that anger fuels protest and activism, and that's sort of counter to there's in the climate activism space. We've often been told that that you should be saying things that are nice and everybody's respectful and all this, but it turns out that if you want people to turn out and that parade to turn out, anger can be one of the things that does that. And I do feel like citizens of the world ought to be able to, it seems like there are forces that are very good at harnessing anger that are being geared towards things like a fascist movement, etc. And I don't think that those people should have the monopoly on it. I think the people that deserve to express their anger the most are the people that have been victim to these forces that have behaved in that way. But anyways,
Oh,
that
hang on a second. I want to respond to that because I
sure,
actually, so in 2019, I attended an energy futures lab, which is based in Calgary,
yeah,
and we went out to Banff, and we had this 5 days of it was a retreat, and Dr. Anil Chima from Sanford, he's a neuropsychiatrist. He came up to talk to us about narrative, and he talked about the very thing you're saying, and he said, anger, pushing those buttons is really, really effective because it gives you it activates your limbic system and it gives you that jolt of adrenaline. And, it's really, really good. And rage farming, as we now call it, has been perfected to an art
sure,
by the oil and gas, the oil bros, as I call them.
sure.
But Dr. Chima said something that we don't pay enough attention to. He said the only antidote, the only thing that will counter rage and is hope and optimism.
Hmm.
And I challenge you, Steve, to look around the world. No, never mind Canada, but look around the world and point to somebody who's an activist, a writer, a journalist, a politician, somebody who sees the trends in the clean energy, on where the clean energy is going, and has a hope and optimism vision and narrative for that.
I mean, wouldn't you say Al Gore typically has that I mean, he at the same time that he would express that, he would also express things about the fossil fuel industry. But I would say he pushes a hope narrative around that. I would say,
Okay, one guy.
but isn't Biden also pushing a hope narrative on that?
I don't think that Biden is particularly inspiring.
You know
And
why? Let me counter that. The reason why I say Biden is inspiring is um, after Bernie Sanders. So prior to Bernie Sanders running for president in 2016, I hadn't heard a politician anywhere talk about climate change as a jobs program, as something
right.
that you can build employment numbers off of, and that it's a stimulus for economies. But Biden has borrowed from Bernie, and so I do end up hearing that case a lot more. I think Trudeau makes that case a little more now, but it's not where it could be. But there certainly is. I think there's some hope and optimism that we end up hearing about that.
But you had to think about that for a while, and there weren't any that are have the kind of profile, or that's not the way I wanted to say it. The forces that are pushing the oil and gas status quo are far better funded. There's tens of
Without a
thousands
doubt.
of
Yeah.
they overwhelm the hope and optimism narrative that we need for the future. And I think that one of the responses we need going forward is we need more people talking about a hope and optimism narrative. And we need to communicate that in a way that people begin to catch on. People in Alberta. I go out all the time, Steve, and I give presentations on the energy transition, the implications for Alberta. And it is a hope, at the end of the day, it is a hope and optimism narrative, because, I point out that, that we can use Alberta hydrocarbons for other things instead of burning them, and we could actually be more prosperous than ever before. And that always gets a really positive response. And then people say, what can we do? What can we do? And it's the lack of, I don't have an answer for it. And that's the problem.
Okay, so here's my counter to that. um, I credit the 2019 students movement, Greta Thunberg, and of course Fridays for Future all over the world. We have a really excellent Fridays for Future group right here in Calgary. I credit them more than anything else as being responsible for countries in the world responding in 2020 and 2021 to all these net zero promises and all that. I don't think they came to that on their own. I don't think they came to that and said, it's time for us to do this. I think they felt pressure. And that pressure didn't come. There's not a lot of hope and optimism that came out of Greta Thunberg, and rightly so. It's not about that. It's about calling out the villains, and it's about calling out the BS, as she says, and the blah blah blah. And I think there's a lot of energy that gets generated around that. And quite frankly, I'm more interested myself in the kind of movement that creates, rather than folks that are just going to be hopeful. Because folks that are hopeful about the renewable energy takeover, there's a very good chance they just sort of sit back and say, well, that this is going to happen anyways. This is the way the world's going. Well, what we're seeing is the world isn't necessarily going in favor of the way of science and the right thing to do. There's large forces looking to push back on data, science, expertise, and all of this, so they can continue doing as they've always done. So that's I typically don't end up getting to debates in these interviews, but I'm glad that we have, and I think it's probably an ongoing conversation.
No, Steve, you raise a perfectly legitimate point, and one that I maybe downplayed and shouldn't have in my previous answer. So let me go back to Dr. Chima.
Yeah.
He says that the most effect, when you're responding to an angry populist kind of narrative around fossil fuels and climate change and so on, he said it's not just the hope and optimism narrative. You have to have marry it with a criticism of what's wrong.
Yeah.
You do need to get people angry. Do need people to get upset and realize that we're in trouble, and we've got all sorts of issues that we need to sort out, and we're being gaslit by a particular industry and some politicians and all of that stuff. And then if you can follow that with the hope and narrative, hope and optimism narrative, Dr. Chima says that's the most effective. You really get people's hearts then when you do
I like that.
So,
maybe a call to action on the tail end of it. That makes sense to me.
yes, the call to action, and I guess what I said is I'm not sure what the call to action should be.
Right. Yeah. Fair enough. Okay, so I've kept you here for way longer than I had planned, but that's what happens when you have interesting conversations and nobody's there to blow the whistle on me. I let it happen. But what I'd like to be able to do, Markham, is we've got a podcast coming up for December. And what I've been asking my other guests for COP28 is what they think the best story on climate was for 2023, and what the worst story for climate was in 2023. And so the way that I'd ask it to you is tell me what you think the worst is first, and then we get to end on the high note of what you think the best is. But what do you think was the worst story on climate this year?
The worst story at COP28 was the perception that the oil and gas industry essentially arrived to sell itself.
Yeah.
Now, I know the industry itself has pushed back against that. And I've been reading on LinkedIn some of the people who went there that I know, from the oil and gas industry, and they say, no, no, no. If you want us to be part of the solution, we have to be at the table. That's really important. The problem is the industry thinks that when it sits down at the table, that it's engaging in a conversation, and it rarely does.
Right.
What invariably happens is they use it to sell, sell, sell.
Yeah.
And the Alberta government has this flimsy document called Emissions Reduction and Energy Development Plan, which they say is a climate plan, and it is nothing of the sort. Nothing of the sort. It's an oil and gas marketing plan that's got a little bit of trimming with some climate initiatives like hydrogen and an industrial carbon tax and a few other things. But it is essentially an oil and gas marketing plan, and the industry is just tone deaf. It doesn't understand how it sounds to other people outside of the industry. And I think there was too much of that. I would think they brought their culture into that table or into that event, and I'm not sure that it was very productive.
And then for the best story, and again, this doesn't have to be COP28. I mean, for 2023, generally the best climate story.
The best climate story by far, and I've expounded on this at great length already here on your podcast, but is the emergence of industrial policy in China, the EU, in the US. We're now seeing it in some other advanced economies like France and Japan and South Korea around clean energy industry and clean energy manufacturing. I think this is not a sexy story. Like how you build solar panels and how you increase their efficiency by 0.5%, or how you bring their costs down by $1 a unit or something. That's not sexy stuff. But this is the foundation upon which revolutions are built. And so the foundation is getting stronger all the time for the clean energy revolution. The global energy system is literally being re-engineered in real time now. And we're watching states like California grapple with how do you do that, without making your power grid really unreliable, or the EU suddenly doesn't have 40% of its gas supply disappears, vaporizes because of Russia, those sorts of things, and watching how people grapple. And so maybe now that I think about it, that's actually a really good part of the story too, is that the EU, for example, when Russia did it, when it cut off gas, they said, okay, well, we have a response to you, sir. We will increase energy efficiency. We will look for alternate supplies in the short term, and we will greatly accelerate our build out of renewables so that we can electrify quicker than we had originally planned. And it's working. And it's actually turned out to be, it's working reasonably well. There's some hiccups. Germany's having some trouble with its industrial base, that kind of stuff. But this is stuff that can be sorted out. It's not a disaster. The European economy didn't collapse like some people thought it would. And so that, I guess, is an outgrowth or a consequence of all of this growth of clean energy industry. And I think for me, that is far and away the most important energy story.
Markham Hislop, thank you so much for coming on to our show and sharing the wisdom and engaging in some spirited debate. We all benefit from the work that you do on energy generally, and I'm really a big fan of what you're doing, exposing the Alberta Energy Regulator and what's going on there. But thanks again for your time.
Well, before I go, maybe I could provide a few places where people can
Sure.
find me. I'm not very good at that kind of thing, but
and I'll just say that, yeah, you mentioned that, and then we will put that in our show notes, and we will put links in our threads as well, so folks know how to find your stuff. Shoot, go ahead.
Energy.media, energi.media is our website. You can find me on Twitter or X these days at politicalham, and also at Energy Media gets you into our stuff on most social media platforms. So we also have an app that you can download from both an Android and an Apple app that works really well to keep track of all of our stuff. And you can find our podcast, Energy Talks, on all the major podcast platforms.
You want to get as smart as possible on energy from a Western Canadian perspective, I can't recommend Markham's work enough. That concludes today's show, but the live coverage continues every day. Well, I mean, for one more day, we will continue posting in the days to come about COP28 on our socials. Finally, I want to thank our sponsors, Greengate Energy, Skyfire Energy, and Radical Balance. And finally, I just want to thank you, the viewer. Thanks for caring for the right things. We'll see you tomorrow.